This is Madia-as Digdigan Buenaflor, extending an invitation to each and every one of you everywhere, as my way of commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I will read and serialize my novel, The Blood of Three, starting on Tuesday, August 27, and continuing episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Follow the drama on my YouTube channel. May we forever exhale and inhale love and peace. At another position of the compound, a grinning, maddened Sergeant Momoto emerged from a bullet-ridden barrack carrying a box of gunpowder. He was headed for the stockade of the prisoners. Death to you all. I, Sergeant Momoto, will free you from your misery. You are all dead anyway, so here I come to free you from your hell. He was cursing and shouting that he would kill all their American prisoners if it was the last thing he would do. Michi, who was desperately treating their wounded, saw Sergeant Momoto and heard his diabolical ranting. Without regard for his safety, he darted after Momoto and held him back. Sergeant, please stop it. Think, give up your plan. But Sergeant Momoto was too intoxicated with hate and power and ranted. With this gunpowder, I'll turn that stockade into an inferno, annihilate those dying American POW. They'll join us all in hell. The arrogance and sneers on his face stunned Michi as the sergeant shoved him down and trudged on. Michi redoubled his determination to stop the sergeant at all costs, for he would not allow such dastardly and cowardly act on helpless prisoners. With just that thought in mind, Michi chased after Sergeant Momoto and plunged into his back the bloody surgical knife he had in his hand all along. Sergeant Momoto crumpled and fell down with a loud thud, still tightly clutching the bags of gunpowder. As Michi looked down at Momoto, who was gargling in his own blood, Momoto's voice, steeped in arrogance, kept ringing through his head. Earlier that evening, Momoto had bragged to the guards about his conquest of the beautiful and young American girl. Without intending it, Michi was destined to take justice in his own hands. He had avenged Joy's death and the rape of her innocence. Michi was shaken as bullets hit all around him. He ducked. An explosion rocked the earth behind him, and as he looked back at where Sergeant Momoto had fallen, he saw a column of fire and black smoke engulfing the sergeant. The horror of the sight distracted Michi, and before he could distance himself from the scene, bullets caught up with him. He writhed and coiled to the ground. With his ebbing consciousness, he struggled to crawl toward the clinic. As a few paces away, Lieutenant Joe Fern was in his elements, firing his gun swiftly from left to right and at all directions, cheering at his every fallen target. His unquenchable thirst to be part of the action, coupled with his fighting spirit, burned him into one unstoppable destructive force as he covered the ground, leaving deaths behind him. His great agility and extraordinary courage gave him that feeling of invulnerability, forging forward and never looking back. His boyish grin suddenly turned into a grimace as he jerked back. This did not, in any way, stop him from firing. The fighting in the open area of the compound had died down, but the encounter between the farthest rows of barracks had become the fiercest, where the Japanese had solidified their forces for their last stand. Bullets whistled as these ricocheted against the concrete walls. The Japanese continued to fire back at the guerrillas led by Colonel Holt. He signaled his men to spread out and sneak behind the enemies as one group continued firing. The men moved around the rows of barracks, picking off the Japanese one by one. The volley of grenade explosions roused the sleeping Japanese in their barracks at the municipal government edifice and the two school buildings. Sergeant Cruz's men threw hand grenades one after another into the barracks and routed out the Japanese like scampering rats from their underground holes. They flooded out from its barrack, dazed and unprepared and still in their underwear. Some have hastily put on their uniforms. Before they were fully awake, they were gunned down by their own machine guns from their checkpoints. Just then the ground shook, followed by the rumbling sound. A parade of truckloads of Japanese reinforcements have arrived, but the guerrillas were prepared for them. The engagement did not last long. Hand grenades, dynamites, machine guns, and powerful artilleries have eliminated the last hope of Colonel Hiroshi. The radio transmission to Colonel Hiroshi of the total annihilation of his reinforcement, together with the weakening of his last stronghold at the compound, drove him to make a drastic decision. He was a soldier and would die fighting like one. On his face was a resolute resolve to fight. He could have chosen to put an end to the needless prolonging of the hopeless fight and waste of life, but there was a tradition he had to hold. A samurai must die rather than surrender. At their last stronghold, Colonel Hiroshi's forces fought tenaciously and fiercely up to the last moment. This stubborn but brave breed of fanatical soldiers seemed to have made a common and irrevocable decision to fight to the end. Not one had surrendered until the last man had fallen. Colonel Hiroshi, armed with his pistol and followed by his armed guards, stepped out of the reinforced quarters and with dignity faced the guerrillas stationed inside the church and into the ground where they fought ferociously until all his men fell dead. Captain Tagore pointed his gun to his head and took his own life, an act of harakiri without its sacred ritual. Standing alone and surrounded by the enemies, Colonel Hiroshi fought until bullets mercilessly riddled his body. His last thoughts took a flight to Japan, where his wife was reading the final letter he wrote. In his neat cursive writing, he promised he would breathe his last by her side, and he did, in spirit. The fighting ceased. Every gun emplacement behind the thick wall of the vast compound was now securely guarded by Filipino guerrillas. On their faces shone the indescribable feeling of joy and gratitude for having survived their fiercest encounter, which may, perhaps and hopefully, be their last. Hope and pride gleamed in their eyes, gazing far towards the sea, waiting for the landing forces of General MacArthur. When Sergeant Leon's men broke through the stockade, they were confronted by a sight so horrendous, it literally immobilized them. These battle-hardened men, who fought and killed, were crying unashamedly as they unchained the stand POW, many of whom just stared blankly at their liberators. Others clutched tightly like babies as they were gently carried out. The few managed to wobble out with the remaining strength of their emaciated bodies, grasping to breathe the air of freedom for the first time after a long period of subhuman existence. Some fell before they could take their first step, but they kept on trying to prove to themselves that they were still alive. Yet they appeared more dead than alive. The scene left no man unmoved. Bathed in his sweat and blood, his shirt crumpled and torn, Lieutenant Ernesto Duran emerged from the long, harrowing experience. He had just returned to the armory to look for Mr. Miura, but he was nowhere to find. Frustrated and anxious, he kept looking for him. In the midst of the encounter, he did not have the opportunity to thank him. He felt remiss and ungrateful. He had to let him know how big a role he played in their victory. And Colonel Holt had to meet him and personally thank him for his heroism. Perhaps apologize even, just in his thoughts, for ever doubting Mr. Miura. Searching for Mr. Miura in the church, outside the church, turning over Japanese bodies, hoping against hope that he was not one of them, Ernesto kept looking, scanning the wide expanse of the garrison scattered with corpses, all spattered with crimson, thousands and thousands of them. As he walked through the havoc of the snake attack and the fierce hour-long encounter, Ernesto felt drained and empty. After running from one barrack to the next, from one stockade to the next, all now empty of their occupants, Ernesto stopped at a room that looked like a clinic. His attention was caught by a ukulele dangling on its wall. He recognized that ukulele very vividly. It was something he could not ever forget, for it stabbed his heart, not the ukulele itself, but the young Japanese who was holding it. That sight on that particular afternoon stole away precious hours of his sleep, wondering if the young Japanese had stolen his joy bell from him. But he also would never forget that young Japanese who lied to his own people to save Joybill and him. He entered the clinic and took the ukulele from the wall, then looked around, but no life stirred among the lifeless bodies. Fearing the worst, he paused and just then noticed the writings on the ukulele, which was inscribed with Michi's name, Michi. It's such a good name, an innocent and pure name. He concluded that Michi could have not been working at the clinic, someone who was there to save lives and not to take. He was decided to find him. He could vouch for him and his goodness, his kindness and his sense of decency. As Ernesto checked each of the bodies near the clinic, he spotted a familiar face. It was pale and the features were his. He recognized the fine and delicate innocent features of the man. Actually, not of a man, but of a boy. Michi, it is Michi. Ernesto knelt down and touched Michi's cold face. He made the sign of the cross and said a silent prayer. It would be difficult for him to give the sad news to Joybill. Ernesto was sure that Joybill loved this boy as a friend would love another. Ernesto called one of his men. Take Michi to the church. He is a good Japanese. After saying goodbye and throwing a last grateful look at Michi as his body was carried away, Ernesto walked away with a heavy heart for the death of an innocent and undeserving victim of a cruel war. He walked away carrying the ukulele of Michi. A Japanese, he is considered his savior, his angel, a friend. Along the way, Ernesto met Colonel Holt, who was checking their casualties, giving orders to his men to gather all the dead, both theirs and the enemy's. With Colonel Holt was Tommy gathering the tags of the casualties. He took his duty seriously and did it with reverence, aware that he was holding in his hands the last proof of this men's existence, something their loved ones could hold on in their hands and treasure the essence left in that small, cold piece of tag. At the garrisons, there were no Japanese prisoners. No one surrendered. They came across Colonel Hiroshi, the American colonel, took the insignia of the Japanese commanding officer of the bastion, and ordered his body taken to the church. He saluted his Japanese counterpart, then went on, followed by Ernesto. Colonel Holt, all gun emplacements are secured and manned by our men, Sergeant Manuel reported. Excellent, Sergeant Manuel. Lower the Japanese flag. Colonel Holt gave the order, but it sounded more like an invitation. Raise both the Filipino and the American flags. Yes, Colonel Holt, it's my honor and pleasure. Sergeant Manuel grinned from ear to ear and sprinted away to fulfill what seemed to be his lifelong dream, to see once again his country's flag flying side by side with the American flag, and hopefully one day to fly alone up there, proud to stand on its own. This was one order he hungered to perform, his proudest moment. From the guards at the gut emplacement that faced the sea, they heard the joyous shouts. A guerrilla reported to the colonel. Colonel Holt, the fleet of General MacArthur had been sighted. Thank you, Colonel Holt patted the man and gave a big smile. Good job. The man grinned and like a small boy yelled at the top of his voice, announcing the arrival of General MacArthur's forces. Hysterical cheering erupted all over the compound. Ernesto heard the news, but his attention was drawn to a familiar face, a groaning just a few feet from him. He scanned the ground and finally found the source of the voice. The man, an American, was still moving. He dashed to him. Joe, thank God. Ernesto was frantic at the sight of Joe, who looked seriously wounded and drained of color. Colonel Holt, I've found Joe. That's all for today, to be continued on Tuesdays and Thursdays. May we all forever exhale and inhale love and peace. Thanks for being with me today. I hope you will inspire me with a like, share, and subscribe.